The bullet whistled past her ear with a sound like death itself. Sarah Martinez pressed her cheek against the cold concrete, her heart hammering against her ribs as another shot cracked through the air above her position. 6 months ago, her fellow soldiers had laughed when she stepped up to the sniper qualification range. They called her Princess and Barbie with a Barrett. They made bets on how quickly she'd wash out. None of them were laughing now. In this abandoned building in Kandahar, with enemy fire pinning down her entire unit, Sarah was the only thing standing between her brothers in arms and a body bag ride home. The same hands they'd mocked for being too delicate for a sniper rifle now held their lives in perfect, steady aim. This is the story of how a young woman from small-town Texas proved that when everything falls apart, sometimes the person everyone underestimated becomes the hero everyone needs. It's a story about more than just proving doubters wrong. It's about discovering that your greatest strength often comes from the very thing others see as your greatest weakness. What happened on that qualification range was just the beginning. What happened in that firefight would change everything. Sarah Martinez had always been the girl who didn't quite fit the mold. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Creek, Texas, population 2,847, she was the daughter of a high school math teacher and a nurse. While other girls her age were focused on homecoming dances and weekend mall trips, Sarah spent her afternoons at her grandfather's ranch, learning to shoot tin cans off fence posts with his old hunting rifle. Her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, was a Vietnam veteran who never talked much about the war, but he understood the language of precision and patience that came with marksmanship. He taught Sarah that shooting wasn't about aggression or showing off. It was about breathing, about finding that perfect moment of stillness between heartbeats, about understanding that every shot mattered because you might not get a second chance. Mija, he would say in his weathered voice, watching her line up another shot. Shooting is like life. You can't force it. You have to let it happen. Sarah absorbed these lessons like a sponge. While her friends struggled with the concept of patience in their instant gratification world, Sarah learned to wait for hours if necessary to get the perfect shot. She learned to read wind patterns in the movement of grass, to calculate distance by the way heat shimmer played across the landscape, to control her breathing until her heartbeat became a metronome she could predict and work around. By the time she graduated high school, Sarah could put 5 rounds through the same hole at 300 yards with her grandfather's bolt-action rifle. But in Cedar Creek, being the best shot in town wasn't exactly a career path that most parents encouraged their daughters to pursue. Her mother, Elena Martinez, had other plans. "You're too smart for this small town, Sarah," she would say, pushing college brochures across the kitchen table. "You could be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. Why would you want to throw your life away on something so dangerous?" But Sarah had already made up her mind. The September 11th attacks had happened when she was 15, and like many young Americans, she felt a calling to serve. Unlike most of them, however, she had a very specific skill set that she knew could make a difference. She had watched enough news coverage of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to understand that precision marksmanship could save lives, could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The day Sarah announced she was enlisting in the Army, her parents' reaction was exactly what she expected. Her father, Carlos, sat quietly at the kitchen table, methodically folding and unfolding his napkin while her mother paced the kitchen like a caged animal. "This is insane, Sarah," her mother said, her voice rising with each word. "You're throwing away your future for what? To play soldier? To prove some point about how tough you are?" "It's not about proving anything, Mom," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. "It's about using the skills I have to make a difference." "Skills?" Her mother laughed bitterly. "You mean shooting tin cans? That's not a skill, Sarah, that's a hobby. A dangerous hobby that's going to get you killed." Her grandfather, who had been sitting silently in his favorite chair in the corner of the kitchen, finally spoke up. "Elena, let the girl make her choice." "Dad, don't encourage this madness," her mother snapped. "You of all people should know what war does to people." Miguel's dark eyes met Sarah's across the room. In that look, she saw understanding, respect, and something else. "Pride, I know exactly what war does to people, he said quietly. And I know what happens when good people decide it's someone else's job to fight it. The argument continued for weeks, but Sarah's mind was made up. She enlisted on her 18th birthday, much to her recruiter's delight. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been trying to meet his quota for months, and here was a young woman with perfect scores on her ASFOB, a clean background, and an unusual proficiency with firearms. Have you given any thought to your military occupational specialty? He asked during one of their meetings. Sarah didn't hesitate. I want to be a sniper. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious. The Army doesn't exactly have a sniper MOS for enlisted personnel. You'd be looking at infantry first, then try to get into a designated marksman role, and maybe if you're very good and very lucky, you might get a shot at sniper school. Then, that's what I'll do. Sarah, I have to be honest with you, Rodriguez said, leaning back in his chair. In my 15 years as a recruiter, I've seen maybe 3 women even attempt the infantry track, and none of them made it through. It's not that I don't think you can do it, but the physical standards, the culture, the mental pressure, it's designed to break people down. Then, I guess I'll have to be stronger than they expect. The bus ride to Fort Benning, Georgia, for basic training was the longest 8 hours of Sarah's life. She stared out the window at the passing landscape, each mile taking her further from everything she'd ever known and closer to a world where she would have to prove herself every single day. Fort Benning was a shock to the system. The drill sergeants were exactly as advertised, screaming, intimidating figures who seemed to take particular pleasure in making life miserable for anyone who showed even a hint of weakness. Sarah quickly learned to keep her head down, follow orders precisely, and never, ever give them a reason to single her out. But being overlooked was impossible when you were one of only 12 women in a company of 240 soldiers. Well, Drill Sergeant Phillips announced on their first day of weapons training, his voice carrying across the range like a crack of thunder. Looks like we got ourselves a little Annie Oakley here. Martinez, front, and center. Sarah's heart sank as every eye in the company turned toward her. She had made the mistake of mentioning her shooting experience during their initial interviews, and word had apparently made its way up the chain of command. Yes, Drill Sergeant, she replied, jogging to the front of the formation. I hear you think you're some kind of sharpshooter, Martinez. That true. I have some experience with firearms, Drill Sergeant. Some experience, Phillips repeated mockingly. Well, let's see what some experience looks like when it counts. You're going to demonstrate proper firing position for your fellow soldiers. What followed was 10 minutes of the most humiliating instruction of Sarah's life. Despite doing everything correctly, Phillips found fault with every aspect of her positioning, her grip, her breathing technique. The other soldiers snickered and whispered among themselves as he berated her for imaginary mistakes. This is what happens, Phillips announced to the group, when civilians think they know something about soldiering. You might have impressed your daddy with your little pea shooter back home, Martinez, but this is the real deal. The message was clear. Being good at something before you arrived meant nothing. You were here to be broken down and rebuilt in the Army way. But the real test came 3 weeks later during their first live fire exercise. Sarah watched as soldier after soldier stepped up to the firing line, many of them struggling to hit targets at the basic qualification distances. When her turn came, she took her position, controlled her breathing the way her grandfather had taught her, and began to fire. Her first shot was a perfect bullseye at 100 yards. The second shot was in the same hole. By the 5th shot, the range had grown quiet except for the sound of a rifle. Cease fire, Phillips called out, his voice betraying just a hint of surprise. He walked down to check her target, then returned to the firing line with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. 40 out of 40, he announced. Perfect score. The silence that followed was deafening. Perfect scores were rare, even among experienced soldiers, and for a recruit to achieve one on her first attempt was almost unheard of. Lucky shot, someone muttered from the ranks. 40 lucky shots, another voice replied skeptically. Phillips seemed to consider this for a moment, then made a decision that would change everything. Martinez, you're going to shoot again. Different target, different distance. Let's see if lightning strikes twice. Sarah nodded and took her position again. This time, Phillips had them move back to the 200-yard line, a distance that wasn't even part of the standard qualification course. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her. The knowledge that this moment would define how her fellow soldiers saw her for the rest of training. She breathed in slowly, let half the air out, and found that perfect moment of stillness her grandfather had taught her to recognize. The shot broke clean, and through her scope, she could see the bullet hole appear in the center of the target. 39 more times, the same result. When Phillips returned with the target, his expression had completely changed. Gone was the mocking drill sergeant who had humiliated her weeks earlier. In his place was a soldier looking at something he didn't quite understand, but definitely respected. 80 out of 80, he announced. Perfect score at 200 yards. This time, there were no muttered comments about luck. The other soldiers stared at Sarah with a mixture of awe, respect, and something that might have been fear. They had just witnessed something exceptional, and they knew it. After the exercise, Phillips pulled her aside. Martinez, where exactly did you learn to shoot like that? My grandfather taught me, drill sergeant. He's a Vietnam veteran. Phillips nodded slowly. Your grandfather teach you anything else? Patience, drill sergeant. He taught me that shooting is about patience. Well, your patience just earned you an opportunity. I'm putting in a recommendation for you to attend the designated marksman course after you complete advanced individual training. You interested? Sarah felt her heart race, but she kept her expression calm. Yes, drill sergeant. Very interested. Good. Because what you just did, that's not normal, Martinez. That's special. And the Army has uses for special. As she walked back to the barracks that evening, Sarah felt the weight of possibility settling on her shoulders. She had taken the first step on a path that would lead her far from the tin cans and fence posts of her grandfather's ranch, toward a future she could barely imagine. But even as excitement built in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that proving herself once was only the beginning. Every day from now on, she would have to prove herself again. And eventually, that proof would be measured not in holes and paper targets, but in the lives of the soldiers who depended on her precision when everything went wrong. She thought about her grandfather's words about shooting being like life, about not being able to force it. As she looked ahead to the challenges that awaited her, Sarah began to understand that everything she thought she knew about herself was about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. The girl from Cedar Creek who could shoot tin cans off fence posts was gone. In her place stood a soldier with a gift that the Army was very interested in developing. The question was whether that gift would be enough when the stakes became more than just qualification scores and the target started shooting back. The designated marksman course at Fort Benning was a different world entirely from basic training. Where basic had been about breaking down civilians and rebuilding them as soldiers, the DM course was about taking soldiers and transforming them into something more specialized, more deadly, and infinitely more precise. Sarah arrived at the course with her perfect qualification scores, preceding her like a reputation she wasn't sure she wanted. The other soldiers in her class were all infantry veterans with at least one deployment under their belts. They had earned their way to this training through combat experience, proven leadership, and recommendations from their unit commanders. Sarah had earned her spot by shooting holes in paper. The difference was not lost on anyone, especially not on the other students. Well, look what we got here, said Private First Class Danny Morrison, a wiry soldier from Alabama with tobacco-stained teeth and scars on his hands that spoke of hard-earned experience. Fresh meat straight from basic. Hell, girl probably never even seen combat. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, but it wasn't entirely friendly either. These were soldiers who had been shot at, who had lost friends, who had earned their stripes in places where mistakes meant body bags. To them, Sarah represented everything that was wrong with the Army's new approach to warfare. Too much emphasis on test scores, not enough on real-world experience. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the course instructor, seemed to understand the dynamic immediately. A compact man with intelligent eyes and a presence that commanded instant respect, Torres had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan as a sniper with the 75th Ranger Regiment. His approach to instruction was matter-of-fact and completely without ego. "I don't care what any of you did to get here," he announced to the class on their first day. "I don't care about your deployment history, your combat experience, or your qualification scores. What I care about is whether you can do the job when lives depend on it. Everything else is just noise." His eyes found Sarah in the group. "Some of you are here because you've proven yourself in combat. Others are here because you've shown exceptional potential. Both paths are valid, and both come with their own challenges. Combat veterans sometimes have to unlearn bad habits formed under stress. High potential rookies sometimes have to learn that real shooting is nothing like range shooting." The coursework was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Where basic training had been about following orders and executing tasks correctly, the DM course required her to think critically, to make complex calculations under pressure, and to understand the science behind precision shooting in a way that went far beyond her grandfather's intuitive teachings. She learned about ballistics coefficients, about how humidity and temperature affected bullet trajectory, about reading wind at distances where a 5-mile-per-hour error could mean the difference between a hit and a miss. She learned about range estimation using mil dots and mathematical formulas, about atmospheric pressure and its effects on bullet drop, about the Magnus effect, and how bullet spin influenced accuracy. The academic portion of the course played to Sarah's strengths. She had always been good at math and science, and the precision required in calculating long-range shots appealed to her analytical mind. But the physical demands of the course were something else entirely. Designated marksmen weren't just shooters. They were often required to move independently, to carry heavier equipment than regular infantry, to maintain their effectiveness under conditions of extreme stress and fatigue. The training reflected this reality. A sniper who can't move is just an expensive target, Torres explained during one particularly grueling exercise that required the students to low-crawl 800 yards through thick brush while carrying their full kit, then immediately engage targets at varying distances. Sarah discovered muscles she didn't know she had as she dragged herself through mud, thorns, and rocky terrain with a rifle, ammunition, and observation equipment that together weighed more than 60 pounds. By the time she reached her firing position, her uniform was shredded, her arms were bleeding from dozens of small cuts, and her hands were shaking from exhaustion. "Martinez," Torres called out, "you've got 30 seconds to get into position and engage 5 targets between 400 and 800 yards. Wind is variable, light is changing, and your spotter is down with a head injury. Go!" This was the moment Sarah realized that everything she thought she knew about shooting was just the beginning. Range shooting was about perfect conditions, controlled environments, and unlimited time to prepare. Combat shooting was about making impossible shots under terrible conditions while people were trying to kill you. Her first shot missed completely. The combination of exhaustion, stress, and changing light conditions had thrown off her calculations. She heard Morrison chuckle from somewhere behind her. "Breathe," she whispered to herself, echoing her grandfather's voice. "Find the stillness." But there was no stillness to be found. Her heart was racing, her hands were shaking, and sweat was dripping into her eyes. This was nothing like the peaceful afternoons on her grandfather's ranch. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment and tried to remember what Torres had taught them about shooting under stress. The key wasn't to eliminate the stress, he had said, but to incorporate it into your shooting routine. To accept that your heart would be racing and compensate for it. To understand that perfect conditions were a luxury that combat snipers couldn't afford. She opened her eyes, adjusted her scope for the effects of her elevated heart rate, and fired again. This time, the shot found its target. For more shots, for more hits. By the time she finished the exercise, her scores were acceptable, but she was under no illusion that acceptable was good enough. After the exercise, Torres approached her while she was cleaning her rifle. "Rough day out there, Martinez." Yes, Sergeant. I'll do better tomorrow. Tell me what went wrong. Sarah considered the question carefully. I was still thinking like a range shooter instead of a combat marksman. I was looking for perfect conditions instead of adapting to imperfect ones. Torres nodded. Good analysis. What are you going to do differently? I need to train under worse conditions. If I can shoot well when everything is going wrong, then shooting when things are just bad will be easy. Now you're thinking like a sniper. From that day forward, Sarah began seeking out the worst possible training conditions. She practiced shooting after physical training when her muscles were fatigued and her hands were unsteady. She practiced in rain, in wind, in failing light. She practiced with equipment that was deliberately miscalibrated, forcing her to compensate on the fly. Morrison and the other combat veterans initially viewed these extra training sessions as showboating, but their attitudes began to change as they watched Sarah's scores improve under conditions where theirs remained static. More importantly, they began to see something in her approach that reminded them of their own experiences in combat. Girls got something. Morrison admitted to another student after watching Sarah successfully engage targets at 600 yards in a torrential downpour. Don't know what it is, but she's got it. The real test came during the course's final exercise, a complex scenario designed to simulate everything a designated marksman might face in actual combat. Students were required to infiltrate to a firing position, observe and report on enemy activity, engage multiple targets at various distances, and then successfully extract while under simulated enemy fire. Sarah's assigned position was a rooftop 400 yards from the target area, accessed by climbing the outside of a 3-story building in full kit during darkness. The targets are mannequins placed at distances ranging from 200 to 800 yards, some stationary, others moving, all designed to test different aspects of marksmanship under pressure. She began her infiltration at 2,200 hours, moving carefully through the darkened training area while avoiding the course instructors who were playing the role of enemy patrols. The climb to the rooftop was the most terrifying experience of her military career so far. With 60 pounds of equipment on her back, she had to scale up the building using nothing but her fingertips and the small ledges provided by the brickwork. By the time she reached her firing position, her arms were screaming and her hands were raw. But there was no time to rest. According to her mission timeline, she had exactly 15 minutes to engage all targets before enemy reinforcements would arrive at her position. Sarah set up her rifle and began her observations. Through her scope, she could see the mannequin targets arranged throughout the mock village below. Some were partially concealed, others were moving on mechanical tracks, all designed to test her ability to acquire and engage targets under realistic conditions. Her first target was a stationary figure at 300 yards, representing an enemy sniper in an overwatch position. Sarah calculated the distance, adjusted for wind, and took the shot. The target fell immediately. The second target was more challenging, a moving figure at 500 yards, traveling from left to right at approximately 4 miles per hour. Sarah led the target, accounting for both bullet travel time and the target's movement, and fired. Another hit. One by one, she engaged the targets with methodical precision. Each shot required its own calculations, its own adjustment for distance, wind, and movement. By the time she reached her final target, an 800-yard shot at a partially concealed figure, Sarah had achieved 7 out of 7 hits. But the exercise wasn't over. As soon as she fired her final shot, the sound of blank ammunition began echoing through the training area, simulating the arrival of enemy reinforcements. Sarah had to break down her position and extract to the predetermined rally point while avoiding capture. The extraction was even more harrowing than the infiltration. With the simulated enemy fire getting closer, Sarah had to rappel down the outside of the building using a rope and harness system she had only practiced twice before. Then came a 2-mile movement through dense forest to reach the extraction point. She made it with 3 minutes to spare. When Torres announced the exercise results the next morning, Sarah's performance stood out like a beacon. Perfect marksmanship scores, successful infiltration, and extraction and completion of all mission objectives within the allotted time frame. Outstanding work, Martinez, Torres said after dismissing the class. That was some of the best shooting I've seen in this course. Thank you, Sergeant. I'm putting a recommendation for you to attend the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning. It's a long shot for someone with your experience level, but your performance here suggests you might be ready for it. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Army Sniper School was the pinnacle of precision marksmanship training, a course with a failure rate that exceeded 50% and a reputation for breaking even the most experienced soldiers. What would that mean, Sergeant? It would mean transitioning from designated marksman to full sniper qualification. Different missions, different targets, different level of responsibility. DMs support their squad. Snipers operate independently, often behind enemy lines, often for extended periods. It's a completely different world. And you think I'm ready for that? Torres was quiet for a long moment. I think you have the technical skills and the mental discipline. Whether you're ready for the psychological demands is something we won't know until you're tested under real conditions. As Sarah packed her equipment that final day of the DM course, she reflected on how much had changed since she first arrived. The soldiers who had initially dismissed her as a range queen now treated her with the respect accorded to a peer. Morrison had even approached her after the final exercise to offer his congratulations. "You proved me wrong, Martinez," he had said. "Thought you were just another pretty girl playing soldier. Turns out you might actually be the real deal." But even as she accepted their newfound respect, Sarah understood that the real proving ground was still ahead of her. Sniper school would be a different level of challenge entirely. And beyond that waited the ultimate test, actual combat, where the targets would shoot back and mistakes would be measured in lives lost rather than points deducted. The girl from Cedar Creek was gone completely now, replaced by a soldier who could place bullets exactly where she intended them to go under conditions that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. But as she prepared for the next phase of her journey, Sarah began to understand that technical proficiency was only part of what made a sniper effective. The real question wasn't whether she could hit her targets. The real question was whether she could pull the trigger when those targets were human beings who were trying to kill her and her fellow soldiers. And that was a question that could only be answered when the shooting became real. The United States Army Sniper School at Fort Benning was housed in a series of nondescript buildings that gave no hint of the legendary training that took place within their walls. This was where the Army's most elite marksmen were forged, where soldiers learned to kill with precision from distances measured in kilometers rather than meters. Sarah Martinez arrived at the school on a humid Georgia morning in July, her DM course graduation certificate and Sterling Torres's recommendation letter tucked in her personnel folder like golden tickets. She was one of 36 soldiers selected for the 8-week course, drawn from infantry units across the Army. She was also the only woman. The statistics were not encouraging. Historical graduation rates hovered around 40%, meaning that more than half the soldiers who began the course would fail to complete it. The reasons for failure varied. Some couldn't handle the academic rigor, others cracked under the psychological pressure, and many simply couldn't achieve the marksmanship standards required for graduation. The course instructor was Master Sergeant James "Ghost" Patterson, a legendary figure in the sniper community with confirmed kills in 3 different theaters of operation. Patterson had been teaching at the school for 6 years, and his reputation for being fair but absolutely unforgiving preceded him like a dark cloud. "Welcome to Sniper School," Patterson announced to the assembled class on their first morning. "Look around you. Statistically, 15 of you will not be here at graduation. Some of you will quit. Some of you will be dropped for academic failure. Others will be eliminated for failing to meet marksmanship standards. And a few of you will wash out because you discover that you don't have what it takes to kill another human being." His eyes swept across the group, pausing briefly on Sarah before continuing. "Being a sniper is not about being a good shot. Any decent soldier can be taught to hit targets at long range given enough time and training. Being a sniper is about operating alone or in pairs for extended periods, often behind enemy lines, and taking lives in a way that requires you to look directly at your target before pulling the trigger. It's about making decisions that will haunt you for the rest of your life and living with the consequences. The academic portion of the course was immediately more demanding than anything Sarah had experienced. Students were required to master advanced ballistics calculations, meteorological principles, range estimation techniques, and observation and reporting procedures. They studied enemy tactics, weapon systems, and communication methods. They learned about camouflage and concealment, about moving unseen through hostile territory, about surviving for days or weeks with minimal supplies. But it was the practical application of these skills that separated the exceptional from the merely competent. Snipers are not lone wolves, Patterson explained during their first field exercise. They are intelligence gatherers who happen to carry rifles. Your primary mission is observation and reporting. Your secondary mission is precision elimination of high-value targets. Everything else is tertiary. The field exercises were designed to test every aspect of a sniper's capabilities. Students had to infiltrate to observation positions, sometimes crawling for hours through terrain that offered no concealment, and then remain motionless for extended periods while gathering intelligence on simulated enemy positions. Sarah discovered that her small stature, which had sometimes been a disadvantage in other aspects of military training, was actually an asset in sniper operations. She could fit into concealed positions that larger soldiers couldn't access, and she required less food and water to maintain operational effectiveness during extended missions. But her gender, which had been merely an oddity during the DM course, became a constant source of commentary and speculation among her fellow students. "I don't get it," she heard Private First Class Rodriguez say to another student during their third week of training. "What's the Army thinking, putting a girl through sniper school? This isn't some politically correct experiment. People are going to die if she can't do the job." "Maybe she's just that good," replied Specialist Thompson, a veteran of 2 deployments in Iraq. "I've seen her shoot. Girl can put rounds downrange." "Shooting paper targets is one thing," Rodriguez countered. "Shooting people is something else entirely. You really think she's got what it takes to put a bullet in some guy's head while his kids are playing in the yard next to him?" The conversation was typical of dozens Sarah overheard throughout the course. Her fellow students weren't necessarily hostile, but they were skeptical in a way that went beyond normal military hazing. These were combat veterans who had seen what happened when soldiers weren't mentally prepared for the realities of warfare. Their skepticism wasn't personal. It was professional concern about having to depend on someone they weren't sure could perform under pressure. The mocking became more direct during the 4th week of training, when the class began practicing what Patterson called stress shoots. These were exercises designed to simulate the psychological pressure of actual combat by requiring students to engage targets immediately after intense physical exertion or while under time constraints that made careful calculation impossible. Sarah's first stress shoot was a disaster. After completing a 2-mile run in full gear, she was required to immediately engage targets at distances from 300 to 600 yards with only 90 seconds to complete all shots. Her heart rate was over 160 beats per minute. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, and sweat was streaming into her eyes. She missed 3 out of 5 targets. Well, said Corporal Davis, a compact soldier from Montana with a slow drawl and an attitude that suggested he had been expecting this moment. "Looks like Princess Martinez ain't so perfect after all." The nickname stuck. Within days, half the class was referring to her as Princess, and the other half was calling her Barbie in reference to her blonde hair and what they perceived as her overly neat appearance. The instructors didn't participate in the name-calling, but they didn't stop it either. "Ignore them," Thompson advised her after a particularly brutal day when she had failed to complete a stalking exercise within the allotted time frame. "They're just trying to get in your head." But the psychological pressure was working. Sarah found herself second-guessing decisions that should have been automatic, hesitating at moments that required instant action, and making basic mistakes that she hadn't committed since basic training. The breaking point came during the 5th week in an exercise that Patterson called the moment of truth. Students were required to engage a series of human-shaped targets that were partially concealed and positioned to simulate real-world shooting scenarios. The twist was that some of the targets were holding weapons, while others were holding non-threatening objects like tools or books. Students had to identify legitimate targets and engage them while avoiding civilian casualties. Sarah took her position and began scanning the target area through her scope. At 400 yards, she could clearly see a figure holding what appeared to be an AK-47 assault rifle. She calculated the range, adjusted for wind, and prepared to fire. But as she began to squeeze the trigger, the target moved slightly, and Sarah saw that what she had thought was a rifle was actually a garden tool. The figure was a civilian target, one that would have resulted in a course failure if engaged. She held her fire and continued scanning. At 500 yards, another figure appeared, this one clearly carrying a weapon and positioned to threaten friendly forces. Sarah engaged and scored a direct hit. The exercise continued for 30 minutes, with targets appearing and disappearing at various distances. By the end, Sarah had engaged 4 legitimate targets and correctly identified 6 civilians, achieving a perfect score on target discrimination while maintaining acceptable accuracy standards. But her fellow students weren't focused on her successful performance. They were focused on her lengthy hesitation before engaging her first target. "Jesus, princess," Davis said loud enough for the entire class to hear. "You gonna think that hard before every shot? By the time you make up your mind, half the squad's gonna be dead." "Better to think too much than too little," Sarah replied, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Maybe," Rodriguez chimed in, "or maybe you just don't have the killer instinct. Maybe when it comes time to put a real bullet in a real person, you're gonna freeze up just like that." The comment stung because Sarah was beginning to wonder if they might be right. The targets in the exercise had been obviously fake, but she had still hesitated. What would happen when she was looking at an actual human being through her scope? Would she be able to pull the trigger when it mattered? Patterson seemed to sense her inner turmoil during their individual counseling session that week. "You're overthinking this, Martinez," he said bluntly. "Good snipers think fast and act decisively. Hesitation gets people killed. I understand that, Master Sergeant, but target discrimination is important too. You said yourself that we need to avoid civilian casualties." "Absolutely. But there's a difference between careful target identification and paralysis by analysis. What I saw in that exercise looked more like fear than caution." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "I'm not afraid, Master Sergeant." "Everybody's afraid," Patterson replied. "The question is whether you can function effectively despite your fear. Right now, I'm not sure you can." The evaluation was devastating, but it was also motivating. Sarah realized that she had been allowing the comments and attitudes of her fellow students to undermine her confidence in ways that went beyond normal military stress. She had been so focused on proving that she belonged that she had lost sight of what actually made a good sniper. That night, Sarah sat alone in her barracks room and tried to remember what her grandfather had taught her about shooting. It wasn't about being fearless. It was about finding stillness in the midst of chaos. It wasn't about eliminating doubt. It was about acting decisively despite uncertainty. She began training differently. Instead of trying to prove herself to her fellow students, she focused on mastering the skills that Patterson was teaching. She stopped worrying about what others thought of her performance and started concentrating on improving her weaknesses. The change was noticeable within days. Her shooting scores improved dramatically. Her confidence in field exercises returned, and her decision-making became faster and more decisive. By the 6th week of the course, she was performing at the top of her class in every category. The mocking didn't stop, but it changed in character. Where previously it had been contemptuous, now it carried an edge of respect mixed with resentment. "Princess is getting scary good," she heard Davis tell another student after she had completed a perfect stalking exercise that required her to move 600 yards across open terrain without being detected by instructors armed with binoculars. "Yeah, well, let's see how good she is when somebody's shooting back," Rodriguez replied. That test would come sooner than any of them expected. During the 7th week of the course, Patterson announced that the class would be participating in a joint exercise with Special Forces units training at a nearby facility. The scenario would simulate a real-world counterterrorism operation, with sniper teams providing overwatch for assault teams attempting to rescue hostages from a defended compound. "This is as close to the real thing as we can make it," Patterson explained. "The opposing forces are experienced soldiers using realistic tactics. The scenarios are based on actual operations. And while you'll be firing blank ammunition, the stress and decision-making requirements are identical to what you'll face in combat." Sarah was paired with Thompson as her spotter, a combination that surprised her given his initial skepticism about women in combat roles. But Thompson had apparently been impressed by her improvement over the preceding weeks. "Look, Martinez," he said as they prepared their equipment for the exercise. "I had my doubts about you at first, but watching you shoot these past few weeks, I'm starting to think you might be the real deal. Just don't make me look stupid for believing in you." The exercise scenario placed Sarah and Thompson in an overwatch position 800 yards from a compound where terrorists were holding American civilians hostage. Their mission was to eliminate designated targets while avoiding civilian casualties and providing intelligence support for the assault team. As Sarah settled into her firing position and scanned the compound through her scope, she felt a familiar sense of calm settling over her. This was what all the training had been building toward. This was the moment when everything she had learned would either come together or fall apart. Through her scope, she could see figures moving in and around the compound. Some were clearly marked as enemy combatants, others as civilians. The challenge was identifying legitimate targets and engaging them at the precise moment that would support the assault team's mission without endangering the hostages. "Multiple targets in view," she whispered to Thompson, who was observing through a spotting scope and maintaining communication with the assault team. "Requesting permission to engage." "Stand by," Thompson replied. "Assault team is still moving to position." Sarah waited, tracking targets through her scope while maintaining her firing position. Minutes passed like hours as she watched enemy combatants move through the compound, sometimes presenting perfect shots that she couldn't take because the timing wasn't right. Finally, Thompson's voice crackled through her earpiece. "You are clear to engage. Priority target is the machine gunner on the north wall." Sarah shifted her aim to the designated target, calculated the range and wind compensation, and fired. The opposing force soldier dropped immediately, marked as eliminated by the exercise controllers. "Target down," she reported, scanning for additional threats. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah engaged target after target with methodical precision, each shot carefully timed to support the assault team's movement and eliminate threats to the hostages. By the time the exercise concluded, she had achieved 7 confirmed eliminations with no civilian casualties. The after-action review was conducted in front of the entire class, with both sniper school instructors and special forces personnel providing feedback on the exercise. "Outstanding performance by Sniper Team 3, announced the Special Forces team leader. Perfect target discrimination, excellent timing of engagements, and professional communication throughout. This is exactly the kind of support we need from our sniper teams in real-world operations." As the class was dismissed, Sarah noticed that the usual comments and whispered conversations had stopped. Her fellow students looked at her with expressions that ranged from grudging respect to genuine admiration. Even Davis, who had been her harshest critic, nodded approvingly as she passed. But Sarah barely noticed. She was thinking about what Patterson had said earlier about the difference between shooting targets and shooting people. The exercise had been realistic in every way except the most important one. The targets hadn't been real human beings. As she cleaned her rifle that evening, Sarah wondered if the confidence she had rebuilt during the past few weeks would survive the transition from training to combat. The mocking of her fellow students had been painful, but it had ultimately made her stronger. The real test would come when she faced an enemy who wouldn't stop shooting just because she hesitated. The question that haunted her as she prepared for the final week of sniper school wasn't whether she could hit her targets. The question was whether she could live with herself after she did. Sarah Martinez graduated from Army Sniper School with honors, earning the coveted sniper tab and the respect of instructors who had initially questioned whether she belonged in the program. But as she packed her gear for her first deployment to Afghanistan, she carried with her the weight of unfinished business and unanswered questions. The doubts expressed by her fellow students hadn't been entirely unfounded. Despite her technical proficiency and tactical knowledge, Sarah had never taken a human life. She had never looked through a rifle scope at another person with the intention of ending their existence. All the training in the world couldn't fully prepare someone for that moment of ultimate truth. Forward Operating Base Ashank in Afghanistan's Logar province was a dusty collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and guard towers that housed nearly 800 American soldiers. It was Sarah's new home and the launching point for missions into some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. Her unit, Bravo Company of the 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, had been in country for 3 months when she arrived as their new designated marksman. The soldiers of Bravo Company were veterans of multiple deployments, hardened by combat, and skeptical of any newcomer who hadn't yet proven themselves under fire. "Great, another fresh face," muttered Sergeant First Class Mike Williams, the squad leader who would be responsible for Sarah's integration into the unit. "Tell me, Martinez, how many confirmed kills you got?" "None yet, Sergeant," Sarah replied honestly. Williams laughed, but there was no humor in it. "None yet. Well, Princess, this ain't sniper school. Out here, the targets shoot back, and they don't give you points for accuracy. They give you dead soldiers if you miss." The nickname had followed her from training, apparently passed along through the informal networks that connected military units across the globe. Sarah had hoped to leave it behind, but she realized now that she would have to earn a new reputation through performance rather than simply changing locations. Her first weeks at FOB Shank were spent on routine patrols and security operations that gave her a chance to observe the enemy's tactics and adapt to the unique challenges of combat in Afghanistan. The terrain was unlike anything she had trained on, with mountains that reached skyward like jagged teeth and valleys that could hide entire enemy forces. The thin air at altitude affected bullet trajectory in ways that required constant recalculation, and the heat shimmer that rose from sun-baked rocks made range estimation particularly challenging. But the most significant adjustment was psychological. In training, enemy forces have been represented by paper targets, mannequins, or soldiers playing opposition roles. In Afghanistan, the enemy was real, deadly, and committed to killing American soldiers by any means necessary. Sarah's first contact with enemy forces came during her 3rd week in country, during what was supposed to be a routine patrol through a village suspected of harboring Taliban weapons caches. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy presence, but as Sarah had learned during her training, intelligence reports in Afghanistan were often incomplete, outdated, or simply wrong. The patrol was moving through a narrow street flanked by mud brick buildings when the first shots rang out. The distinctive crack of AK-47 fire echoed off the walls as enemy fighters engaged the patrol from concealed positions in the buildings above. "Contact left! Contact left!" shouted Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the patrol leader, as soldiers dove for cover behind whatever protection they could find. Sarah found herself pressed against a low stone wall with Williams and 2 other soldiers as bullets snapped overhead with the angry buzz of angry insects. This was her first experience with the unique terror of being under effective enemy fire, and she was surprised by how different it felt from the stress shoots she had practiced during training. The fear was more intense, more immediate, and more paralyzing than anything she had experienced. These weren't instructors with blank ammunition trying to create realistic training stress. These were enemy fighters with live rounds trying to kill her and her fellow soldiers. Martinez! Williams shouted over the sound of gunfire. We got machine gun position in that building at 2 o'clock. Can you see it? Sarah forced herself to rise slightly above the wall and scanned through her rifle scope in the direction Williams had indicated. At approximately 300 yards, she could see muzzle flashes coming from a second-story window of a building that dominated the street. I see it, Sergeant, she called back. Then eliminate it. We can't move with that gun pinning us down. This was the moment Sarah had trained for, worried about, and dreaded in equal measure. Through her scope, she could clearly see the enemy machine gunner, a bearded man in dark clothing who was systematically engaging the pinned American patrol. She could see his face, his expression of concentration, the methodical way he operated his weapon. For just a moment, Sarah hesitated. This wasn't a paper target or a training mannequin. This was a human being, someone who might have a family, children, a life that extended beyond this moment of violent contact. But then she heard the distinctive whistle of a bullet passing close to her head, followed by the sound of one of her fellow soldiers crying out in pain. The machine gunner's fire was finding its mark, and American soldiers were being wounded or killed while she hesitated. Sarah controlled her breathing, found that moment of stillness her grandfather had taught her to recognize, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect, striking the machine gunner's center mass and dropping him instantly. The enemy fire from that position ceased immediately, allowing the patrol to maneuver and eliminate the remaining enemy fighters. Outstanding shot, Martinez. Williams called out as the engagement wound down. That gun was chewing us up until you took it out. But Sarah barely heard the praise. She was staring through her scope at the window where the machine gunner had been positioned, trying to process what had just happened. She had killed another human being. After months of training and preparation, she had finally crossed that ultimate line that separated soldiers from civilians. The feeling was nothing like what she had expected. There was no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment, no rush of adrenaline. There was just a hollow emptiness and the sure knowledge that she had changed in some fundamental way that could never be undone. The patrol returned to FOB Shank without further incident, but Sarah's performance during the engagement had been noted by everyone involved. Word spread quickly through the unit that the new sniper had earned her first confirmed kill in a situation where it had saved American lives. "Heard you popped your cherry today," said Specialist Jackson, a veteran of 2 previous deployments, as Sarah cleaned her rifle that evening. "I did my job," Sarah replied simply. "Yeah, you did. And you did it well. But how are you feeling about it?" It was a question that Sarah wasn't sure how to answer. How was she supposed to feel about taking another person's life? Relief that she had been able to perform under pressure? Pride in her marksmanship? Guilt about ending someone's existence? "I'm not sure," she admitted. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would." Jackson nodded knowingly. "It never does. But that feeling you got right now, that's normal. Means you're not a psychopath. The soldiers you got to worry about are the ones who feel nothing at all." Over the following weeks, Sarah's reputation within the unit began to change. The soldiers who had initially dismissed her as an untested rookie began to see her as a valuable asset, someone who could be counted on to deliver precise, effective fire when it mattered most. She participated in a dozen more combat operations, each one adding to her experience and confidence. She learned to read the terrain like a map, identifying likely enemy positions and escape routes before they were used. She developed an intuitive understanding of how enemy fighters moved and fought, allowing her to anticipate their actions and position herself accordingly. But most importantly, she learned to live with the knowledge that her precision and skill came with a price measured in human lives. Each confirmed kill was a tactical success that potentially saved the lives of American soldiers, but it was also the ending of someone's existence, the creation of a widow or orphan somewhere in Afghanistan. By the end of her first deployment, Sarah had achieved 17 confirmed kills, a number that placed her among the most effective snipers in her brigade. Her fellow soldiers no longer called her princess or questioned her ability to perform under pressure. She had earned their respect through competence under fire and dedication to the mission. But the respect of her peers came with its own burden. Sarah began to realize that being an effective sniper meant accepting a kind of isolation that went beyond the physical distance of her firing positions. She was becoming someone who solved problems by killing people, someone who measured success by the number of human beings she could eliminate with precision and efficiency. The transition back to civilian interaction during her mid-deployment leave was jarring. After months of living in a world where violence was the primary tool for resolving conflicts, Sarah found herself struggling to relate to people whose biggest concerns were traffic jams and restaurant reservations. "You seem different," her mother observed during her brief visit home to Texas. "Harder somehow." Sarah didn't know how to explain that hardness was a necessary adaptation to survive in a world where hesitation meant death and where taking lives had become a routine part of her job. How could she tell her mother that she had become very good at killing people and that this skill was valued and rewarded by her military chain of command? "War changes people, Mom," was all she could manage to say. When she returned to Afghanistan for the second half of her deployment, Sarah felt more comfortable in the combat environment than she did in the peaceful suburbs of Cedar Creek. The clarity of purpose and the immediate consequences of her actions in combat were easier to navigate than the complex emotional dynamics of civilian relationships. Her squad had been reassigned to a more isolated outpost in Kandahar province, where they would be operating with greater independence and facing more sophisticated enemy tactics. The Taliban in this region were better equipped and more experienced than the fighters they had faced in Logar province. It was here that Sarah would face the ultimate test of everything she had learned, in a situation where her ability to perform under pressure would determine not just the success of the mission, but the survival of every soldier in her unit. The call came during the early hours of a particularly quiet morning, when the desert was still cool and the mountains were barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah was awakened by the urgent voice of her squad leader over the radio. "All stations, this is Bravo 6. We have a downed aircraft approximately 8 clicks northeast of our position. Search and rescue is inbound, but we're the closest ground unit. Mount up in 15 minutes. As Sarah gathered her equipment in the darkness, she had no way of knowing that this mission would put her face-to-face with the largest enemy force she had ever engaged, in a situation where every shot would matter and every mistake would be measured in American lives. The soldiers who had mocked her during sniper qualification were nowhere to be found. In their place were combat veterans who trusted her judgment and depended on her skill. The question was no longer whether Sarah Martinez could shoot straight under pressure. The question was whether she could do it long enough and well enough to keep her brothers in arms alive when everything went wrong. The Black Hawk helicopter had gone down in the worst possible location, a narrow valley surrounded by mountains that provided perfect cover for enemy fighters and limited options for rescue operations. Intelligence reports suggested a significant Taliban presence in the area, but the crew of the downed aircraft couldn't wait for a full-scale clearing operation. Sarah's squad was traveling in 2 up-armored Humvees when they received the updated intelligence briefing over their radio. The situation was worse than initially reported. The helicopter crew was alive, but injured, pinned down in the wreckage by approximately 30 Taliban fighters who had quickly surrounded the crash site. Search and rescue helicopters couldn't land under fire, which meant ground forces would have to clear the area first. "This is going to be a tough one," Staff Sergeant Williams announced to the squad as they approached the valley. "We're outnumbered 3-1. They've got the high ground, and they've had time to set up prepared positions. But those pilots are counting on us to get them out." Sarah checked her equipment one final time as their convoy moved toward the crash site. Her rifle was zeroed perfectly. She had sufficient ammunition for an extended engagement, and her range card were updated for the terrain they would be operating in. But she knew that all the preparation in the world couldn't account for the chaos and unpredictability of close-quarters battle. The first sign of enemy contact came when the lead Humvee rounded a bend in the mountain road and immediately took fire from multiple positions on the slopes above. The distinctive crack of AK-47 round striking armor was followed immediately by the deeper thump of rocket-propelled grenades impacting near the vehicles. Contact! Contact! Multiple enemy positions on both sides of the road. Williams shouted into his radio as their driver swerved to avoid a roadside bomb that detonated just seconds after they passed. Sarah's vehicle came to a stop behind an outcropping of rocks that provided limited cover from the enemy fire raining down from above. Through the bulletproof windows, she could see muzzle flashes winking from concealed positions throughout the valley walls. "Martinez, we need overwatch on that ridgeline." Williams pointed toward a series of enemy positions that were pouring effective fire onto the American vehicles. "Can you get up there and start taking them out?" Sarah scanned the terrain and identified a position approximately 200 yards away that would give her a clear field of fire onto the enemy positions while providing adequate cover from return fire. The problem was that reaching that position would require crossing open ground under direct enemy observation. "I can get there, Sergeant, but I'm gonna need covering fire." "You got it. Thompson, you're with Martinez as spotter. Jackson, Rodriguez, lay down suppressive fire on my mark." Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared for what she knew would be the most dangerous movement of her military career. She would be crossing nearly 200 yards of open terrain while enemy fighters specifically targeted her position. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, would likely result in her death. "Ready?" Williams asked. Sarah took a deep breath and found a place of calm her grandfather had taught her to access during moments of stress. "Ready? Mark!" The sound of American weapons opened up with a thunderous roar as Jackson and Rodriguez began pouring suppressive fire onto the enemy positions. Sarah broke cover and began moving toward her objective position, running in a crouch while carrying her rifle and 40 pounds of additional equipment. Immediately, enemy fire began tracking her movement. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet and snapped through the air inches from her head. She could hear the distinctive whistle of projectiles passing close enough to kill, but she forced herself to maintain steady movement toward her objective. Halfway to the position, Sarah felt the burning sensation of a bullet grazing her left shoulder. The impact spun her slightly, but didn't knock her down. She regained her balance and continued moving, knowing that stopping in the open would mean certain death. She reached the rocky outcropping and dove behind it just as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded where she had been standing moments earlier. The concussion from the blast left her ears ringing, but she was alive and in position. Thompson arrived 10 seconds later, breathing heavily and bleeding from a cut on his forehead where a rock fragment had struck him during their movement. "Jesus, Martinez, that was insane," he gasped as he set up his spotting scope. "I counted at least 6 different positions shooting at us during that run." "Status report," Sarah called out as she began scanning the enemy positions through her rifle scope. "Multiple targets at various ranges," Thompson replied, his voice becoming professional as he focused on his job as spotter. "Priority target is a machine gun position at approximately 400 yards, 2 o'clock from our position. He's been laying down the heaviest fire on our vehicles." Sarah shifted her aim to the indicated position and immediately saw what Thompson was referring to. An enemy fighter was operating a Russian-made PCAM machine gun from a well-concealed position that gave him an excellent field of fire onto the American vehicles below. As she watched, he fired another long burst that sparked off the armor of one of their Humvees. Sarah calculated the range, adjusted for the mountain wind that was gusting unpredictably through the valley, and fired. The shot was perfect, striking the machine gunner's center mass and eliminating the threat immediately. "Target down," she reported, scanning for additional threats. "Good shooting. Next target, sniper position at 600 yards, 11 o'clock. He's been taking shots at our dismounted personnel." Sarah shifted her aim and acquired the new target an enemy sniper who was using a Soviet-era Dragunov rifle to engage American soldiers from an extremely well-concealed position. This would be a much more challenging shot, requiring her to compensate for both distance and the irregular wind patterns created by the mountain terrain. She fired and immediately saw the target drop from view. Target eliminated. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah systematically engaged enemy positions throughout the valley, eliminating threats and allowing the American ground forces to advance toward the crash site. Her accuracy under extreme stress was flawless, with each shot finding its intended target despite the challenging conditions and constant enemy fire directed at her position. But the enemy wasn't giving up easily. As American forces advanced deeper into the valley, the Taliban fighters began coordinating their fire more effectively, concentrating their efforts on suppressing the sniper position that was systematically destroying their defensive positions. "They're starting to focus on us," Thompson observed as bullets began impacting the rocks around their position with increasing frequency. "We're not going to be able to stay here much longer." Sarah knew he was right. They had eliminated nearly a dozen enemy fighters, but the remaining Taliban forces were now directing most of their fire at her position. Soon, the volume of incoming fire would make it impossible to operate effectively. But just as she was preparing to recommend a withdrawal to a new firing position, Thompson's voice crackled with urgency in her earpiece. Multiple enemy fighters advancing on the crash site. Range 300 yards, moving to overrun the downed crew. Through her scope, Sarah could see approximately 8 Taliban fighters moving rapidly down the hillside toward the helicopter wreckage where the injured American crew was sheltering. If they reached the crash site, they would either capture or execute the pilots before the rescue operation could extract them. The advancing enemy fighters were moving through terrain that offered multiple concealment opportunities, making them difficult targets that appeared and disappeared behind rocks and vegetation. Sarah would have to engage them while they were moving, calculating not just for distance and wind, but also for the speed and direction of their movement. "Range to lead target?" she asked Thompson. 320 yards and closing fast. Wind is variable, gusting from the southwest. Sarah acquired her first target, a fighter carrying what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. If he reached the crash site with that weapon, he could eliminate the helicopter crew with a single shot. She led the target slightly, accounting for his movement speed and the time required for her bullet to travel the distance between them. The shot broke cleanly, and the enemy fighter dropped immediately. Target down. Next target. 2 fighters at 280 yards, moving in bounds toward the crash site. Sarah shifted her aim and engaged the second target, then immediately moved to the third without waiting for confirmation. The situation was too desperate for methodical engagement. She had to eliminate threats as quickly as possible to prevent the enemy from reaching the helicopter crew. One by one, she engaged the advancing fighters with a kind of rapid, precise shooting that demonstrated years of training and months of combat experience. Each shot was calculated and deliberate, but the calculations were happening faster than conscious thought, her muscle memory and training taking over in a way that allowed her to operate at a level of efficiency that surprised even her. By the time the last enemy fighter dropped, Sarah had eliminated all 8 members of the assault force that had been advancing on the crash site. The helicopter crew was safe, at least temporarily. "Outstanding shooting, Martinez." Williams's voice came through her earpiece. "You just saved those pilots' lives. Search and rescue is inbound. ETA 5 minutes. But the engagement wasn't over. The remaining enemy fighters, apparently realizing that their assault on the crash site had failed, began concentrating their fire on the American positions with renewed intensity. Sarah's position, which had been identified as the source of the precision fire that had destroyed their attack, became the primary target for every enemy weapon in the valley. The volume of fire directed at their position was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Bullets were striking the rocks around them with the sound of hail on a metal roof, and rocket-propelled grenades were exploding close enough to shower them with rock fragments. "We need to move." Thompson shouted over the sound of incoming fire. This position is compromised. But just as they were preparing to withdraw, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whine of helicopter rotors approaching the valley. Search and rescue was arriving exactly on schedule, but they would be flying directly into the kill zone that the Taliban fighters had established around the crash site. Through her scope, Sarah could see enemy fighters repositioning to engage the incoming rescue helicopters. Several of them were carrying shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles that could easily bring down the rescue aircraft. Thompson, do you see the SAM teams setting up on the North Ridge? I see them. Range approximately 500 yards. They're going to engage the rescue birds as soon as they enter the valley. This was the moment that would define everything Sarah had trained for. The rescue helicopters were flying toward certain destruction unless she could eliminate the surface-to-air missile teams before they could engage. But to do so, she would have to remain in an exposed position under heavy enemy fire and make extremely difficult shots at maximum range. Martinez, this is Williams. Rescue birds are 30 seconds out. Can you neutralize those SAM teams? Sarah looked through her scope at the enemy positions 500 yards away. The range was at the limit of her rifle's effective capability, and the targets were partially concealed and constantly moving. The wind was gusting unpredictably, and she would be firing while under direct enemy fire from multiple positions. Everything she had learned during her grandfather's patient instruction, during the humiliation and doubt of sniper school, during months of combat in Afghanistan, came down to this moment. The lives of the helicopter crew, the rescue pilots, and potentially her entire squad depended on her ability to make impossible shots under the worst possible conditions. Sarah found that place of absolute stillness that her grandfather had taught her to access, that moment between heartbeats where time seemed to slow and everything became clear. She adjusted her scope for the extreme range, calculated the wind compensation, and fired. The first enemy fighter dropped immediately, his surface-to-air missile tumbling down the mountainside. She immediately shifted to the second target, made the same complex calculations in a fraction of a second, and fired again. Another direct hit. The third target was the most challenging yet. The enemy fighter had taken cover behind a large boulder and was only partially visible. Sarah could see just enough of him to attempt a shot, but the margin for error was virtually non-existent. She fired and watched through her scope as the bullet struck the enemy fighter in the only part of his body that was exposed, eliminating the final surface-to-air missile threat, just as the rescue helicopters entered the valley. The rescue operation proceeded without further casualties. The helicopter crew was successfully extracted, and Sarah's squad withdrew from the valley with all personnel accounted for. The engagement was over, but its impact would resonate far beyond that single day in Afghanistan. In the after-action review, military investigators determined that Sarah's precision shooting had been instrumental in the success of the rescue operation. Her 17 confirmed kills during the engagement, including the elimination of the surface-to-air missile teams, had prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of aircraft and personnel. The girl from Cedar Creek, Texas, who had been mocked during sniper qualification for being too small, too pretty, or too inexperienced, had proven that when everything fell apart, she was exactly the kind of soldier the Army needed. But as Sarah cleaned her rifle in the quiet hours after the engagement, she thought about her grandfather's words about shooting being like life, that you couldn't force it, you had to let it happen. She had learned that the same principle applied to proving yourself. You couldn't force people to respect you or believe in your capabilities. All you could do was be ready when the moment arrived and then perform when lives depended on your skill. The mockery had stopped completely now, replaced by the kind of professional respect that could only be earned under fire. But, more importantly, Sarah had learned that the opinions of others mattered far less than her own knowledge that she could be counted on when everything went wrong. Years later, when young soldiers would ask her about how to handle doubt and criticism, Sarah would tell them about the day when a rescue operation hung in the balance, and Precision under pressure meant the difference between success and catastrophe. She would tell them that everyone faces moments when they have to prove themselves, when all their training and preparation comes down to a few crucial decisions made under the worst possible circumstances. And she would tell them that the people who mock your potential today might be the same people whose lives depend on your performance tomorrow. The girl they had called Princess had become a soldier whose precision under fire saved the lives of those who had once questioned whether she belonged. And in the end, that was the only proof that mattered.